The data is absolutely critical here. We have to think about what it is in data that we can create that's harmonised and that is consistent across all countries without excluding, say, emerging markets or smaller businesses. It was Sean who said to me right at the very beginning of this process, we have to do what we say we're going to do. We can't afford to greenwash anymore. And the heavy reliance on self-reporting means that there is a risk that we will encounter that type of greenwash. And there's another big danger which everyone in this meeting will recognise, particularly if they are involved in trade finance delivery at this point in time, which is that we have to avoid the AML KYC like compliance nightmares. And obviously everyone is beginning to incorporate AML and KYC into their structures. Everybody sustainability into their AML KYC structures. As we do that, it might exclude groups. It might become more difficult. It might become more difficult to accept smaller businesses in particular, thereby making trade finance problems worse. So we need to use regulation as an excuse in trade finance to be proactive through credit pricing. So how do we go about doing that? It means that we have to have a consistent approach to data, and so that the data itself becomes a regulatory prerequisite. We have to understand what it is that needs to be standardised. And I think when we were writing the paper together, what we realised was that the regulators themselves haven't clearly thought this through. And again, this is to show you again the slide that we looked at last time in the last session. We can see already that there are a lot of compliance pressures, a lot of regulatory pressures, which are coming in imminently. There's a bunch of deadlines that were at the end of March and a bunch of deadlines now that are coming in through July, through to the 1st of January next year. And they're not just about scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions. They are also about human rights and then exposure to weapons as well. So there are all sorts of things that go beyond just the environmental angle. And nobody is clear, particularly on exactly what we need to measure. So I'm going to stop there. And what I'm going to do is introduce again my panel and just say, on a personal note, this is a huge milestone for Coriolis, because when we started out this process of creating a sustainable sustainable working group, a sustainability working group, what we wanted to do was have a realistic conversation with the industry about how we went about sustainability measurement and how we standardized the how rather than the what and the why. So this is about how to measure, and that's the background that we have to see with all of this, with all of the discussion that's about to happen. So I'd like to introduce my my discussants again. So I'm going to talk first of all to the ITFA members. So Joe Wissing from Credit Suisse and the ITFA's Sustainability Committee, Sean, who is Head of Legal at SMBC, but also Chairman of the ITFA, and then Shaheen Motiar, who is on the Africa Committee, but also works for Standard Bank. So it's a very great privilege to invite you to speak now. And Sean, I'm going to start with you as the person who I first started talking to all of this. Let me start with you, and let's run through some of the key regulatory issues that you see as a banker and as chairman of the ITFA.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. You can blame it all on me, of course.
Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm going to do, Sean. You know,
of course. But actually, you know, what you've set out just now is both shows, you know, the promise of what we could do, but actually also the current problem that we have, because there is a. It looks like my picture is frozen. I'm sorry. But I'm still speaking. So the problem that you're trying to solve for actually is the problem that, you know, the banks have at the moment, which is that we are subject to a number of unclear criteria, regulatory criteria, and a lot of these, as set out in the paper, are in the offing. They're in the near future, but they haven't quite they haven't been finalised yet. And so, for example, on the SFDR, we're still working through what that means. There's a lot of to and fro about what the final shape of these regulations might actually be, and so that means that currently we're in a sort of a little bit of a limbo period, where actually, in a way, we have the ability to use tools like your own. We have the ability, as we're trying to do at the moment, and I should say the responsibility, to reach out to the regulators to tell us what it is that they think is the right way of approaching these things. Because we're at the stage where there is already quite a lot published, but it's very volatile or dynamic, if you like. It's not clear where people have to jump. A very good example, not in the area of trade finance, but in the area of funds, was the decision by Morningstar in February of this year to declassify 1,200 of funds as sustainable. They had basically latched on to some of the labeling that's available through the SFDR, and had declared themselves to be ESG compliant or ESG useful in some way. When Morningstar went back to its own criteria, they actually said, well, in fact, you don't really fulfill, you're not really doing what you're saying you're going to do. So all banks, big and small, have had to come up with ESG, an ESG policy of some sort, and that's currently a bit of a hodgepodge of sort of internal KPIs. And some of these are very well done, some are not. But the point is, they're extremely variable across all the banks. We've recently been looking, for example, in my bank, at some drafting, and it's interesting the number of, and I use that word euphemistically, it's interesting to see the number of options that you actually have to put in standard template documentation, because it's just very unclear, firstly, what it is you're measuring, and secondly, who should measure that. Is it an internal KPI? Do you actually bring in an external auditor of some sort, of which there are a number? Or do you try and do something a little bit more hybrid, which of course is what we could do with your technology, which is to run these things internally, but to use tools such as yours. So that's where certainly my own bank is, I think, and that's where most of the ITFA members are. And especially in relation to the smaller members who don't have the resource of banks such as my own, and the bigger banks who already have or are getting increasingly larger ESG teams, we really need to come up with some sort of industry standard. We can tell people as a trade body what we think people should be doing, but ultimately, for that to be useful, that has to come from a conversation with the regulators, and I hope that's what we've started with this white paper.
Thank you. And I guess what I would say is the banks are in an unenviable position, aren't they? Because number one, they have to implement policy, and that does imminently create a compliance nightmare, whether you like it or not. And the other is that actually it seems to be the bank's responsibility as well to have to approach the regulators and start talking to the regulators about precisely what it is that we need to measure. And we have views on all of that, but it means that the banks themselves are having to take the action, if you like. They're the boots on the ground in all of this, and people talk about sort of climate wars and things like that, but they are the boots on the ground. Jo, what do you think about all of that? Can the banks actually take this responsibility? Is it the bank's responsibility?
Oh wow, that's a very tough question in a way, Rebecca, right? Because the banks definitely, I mean, undoubtedly, they play a massive role here, and that's a very powerful thing. Of course, at the same time, that also comes with the risks that we were already talking about, particularly being accused of greenwashing, being one of the main risks here. Definitely, yeah, the banks have to bear a lot of responsibility here, simply because they are in this position where they can implement certain actions that will drive different outcomes. I hate to liken it to sanctions, but let's be fair, all the sanctions that politics have come up would not work without the financial system playing along and implementing exactly that, right? And of course here, we don't want to create a sanction system, we want to create an incentive system, right? So absolutely, the banks play a huge role here, and as Sean has already pointed out, and as you also rightly say, Rebecca, it certainly is not an easy task to fulfill, because there is not one sort of like clear rule book out there as of today that you could follow, and again, there is a lot of data missing and lacking to then go through the internal sort of like ESG due diligence process. I think it's also undoubtedly now that almost any bank I could think of, or that I deal with at least, has got ESG at the heart of their decision-making process, alongside credit, alongside AML, alongside general transaction risks. So yeah, I mean, we're already playing, but I guess at the moment it's really difficult to sort of like have that level playing field.
So I guess we're playing, but we don't know quite what game we're playing. We don't know what the rules are, and it's probably different rules in different countries as well. So I mean, that means, Sean, doesn't it, that we're going to have greenwash almost inevitably, unless we can regulate, and unless we can inform the regulators that actually we need a consistent approach to data and measurement in all of this.
I think that's right. I think you need. So I think there are two things to say in relation to that. Firstly, I think you're right. We need to have that conversation with the regulators to say what is the way in which you want us to actually satisfy the SFDR or the SDGs, or indeed what is a credible internal KPI for a bank. I think that's one thing. The other thing that's just been mentioned is, and to take your analogy of the game we're playing, are we actually playing, what game are we playing? What are the rules? Are there actually several games here? So in relation to Russia, for example, that touches on the ESG. At one level, that's all about sanctions. And you could say, well, that's about the G. I would put that, so, and in a way, okay, that's fine. We'll put it in the G. We all know we've been doing that through our compliance departments for a long time. But then you have to look at the consequences of the whole Russia-Ukraine crisis. For example, and especially in relation to energy products, should we be actually, as part of the ESG strategy, should we be promoting alternative energy as an ESG objective in and of itself? Because we know that we have to move away from reliance on, not just on fossil fuels, but on Russian fossil fuels. More subtly, do we have to start looking again at how we consider armaments and the whole weapons industries? Because for a long time, the feeling was war is bad, so don't invest in any weapons companies. Now there seems to be, again, we're getting back into the good war, bad war dichotomy, where clearly, if you look at what's happening in Germany, where they've already announced that they're going to spend a great deal more money on their armed services. Should we, and indeed the UK as well, and I imagine most countries in Europe will be doing that. Should we be actually actively supporting the good armaments companies? And what does that mean? Does that mean we have to know exactly where those products are exported to? There are strict rules around this. But is that something that the bank should be policing as well? So I think, and that can only be done through data, and indeed very detailed data. Some of it may be indeed highly confidential in relation to the armaments industries. So I do think data is the way, because as we increasingly get pulled in different directions, or we add new rules, as you've put it, we need to know that we're measuring those. And very often these requirements are jumped on banks very quickly, and we've seen that in relation to the current conflict.
So I mean, super fascinating, and I mean there are so many things to unpick there, and we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it all. But and certainly it feels like that's a bottle of wine conversation at some point. But
a crate, I think.
But exactly. But Shaheen, I want to bring you in, because I think what Sean has raised there is really two things. The first is that the current crisis has completely altered our definition of ESG. So while the regulations themselves are talking about the E element, and that's everything that came out of COP26 and probably will be discussed at COP27. And you know how you measure. I mean, these are I mean, if you like, it's almost a charismatic species, isn't it? It's easy to measure carbon emissions, and so you go for that rather than sort out some of the other things. Social is very difficult, but that then raises, if we're looking at how the current crisis has changed our attitude towards ESG generally, then do we need to start thinking about ESG in the round? And how does that apply in continents like Africa, when, you know, we're playing a completely different regulatory game, aren't we?
Thanks, Rebecca. I think some of what you ask I'll deal with a little later. If I can take sort of a step back. Essentially, when we think about ESG, and for anyone on the call, if you want to get a sense of what a sustainability report looks like from a bank, go to the Standard Bank website. We publish one now annually, and we cover a fair amount of detail of the E, the S, and the G, and we consider them separately, right? Because climate change compared to governance, compared to social issues, and I've got some examples that I'll talk to later around the cocoa industry, or you know, what people are driving in the EV industry now. But I think let's consider them separately, and if we focus on the governance aspects, I'll take a slightly alternative view to what Sean has said. I think for Europe, the Russia-Ukraine situation is sort of in your face. But from an African perspective, I can quote examples of large African telecoms companies that have operated in Iran that had to navigate governance issues. Oil from Iran was nothing new, right? Essentially, there were sanctions in Iran, and buying oil from Iran was a problem. So these are not necessarily new things to navigate from a governance perspective. Most banks who would subscribe to the Equator Principles would understand the concept of dual-use products, or difficult markets, or difficult industries, right? If you work with the DFI, what was the CDC, or IFC, or World Bank, they've got their restricted lists which talk to dual-use goods, or again, difficult products in difficult industries. So I don't think it's new. I think what it is broadening the spectrum of what we, or how we apply the lens. So from that perspective, I think we can sort of breathe, count to 10. If that doesn't work, sort of breathe and count to 12. I'll bring something else into the play. I think coming through the pandemic with 2 years of proper supply chain disruptions, and I'll speak from an African perspective, where we've seen some of the downstream impact of, for example, in the automotive sector, the impact on prices of vehicles on the continent has shot up because there's a shortage of supply. And we tend to be far away from some of the manufacturing hubs, even though in South Africa we have assembly plants and manufacturing plants for BMW, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Toyota, and the like. It still created an impact. There was a fascinating one for me, where there's a plant in the Ukraine that manufactures wiring harnesses, one of the German manufacturers, right, for at least 5 or 6 of their models. And it is the global supply point for wiring harnesses. You can't manufacture a car without that component, right? And it's not something you can add in afterwards. So I think, for me, if I bring it back to the ESG component, when we start thinking about ESG and governance around ESG, one of the things we need to consider is, what is the impact then on supply chains? What COVID has taught us is that we've had to move from just in time, which is something that has been advocated sort of in the last 50 years because it's the ideal in terms of managing inventory and the like, to a point of just in case, right? And if I bring it back to the African continent, and at some point I'll move into the properly esoteric around additive manufacturing and the like, where you move from just in time to just in case to, well, do I really need to have something manufactured 6,000 miles away? Is there an alternative that I can bring onshore, that we can drive in a manner that is environmentally sound, that drives social principles, and that is regulated onshore? Right. The question I'll leave sort of the group with is this, so regulations kick in, and let's assume that we get to the end of this discussion and we find the panacea for regulations. For the global banks or regional banks, the question will then be, which regulations apply? and how will they apply? Examples I would use is I would look at Basel and look at the implementation of Basel. Surprisingly, I would argue that some African countries were more advanced in Basel at some points in time than even the US, right? And so these are things that we need to think about. So I don't think there's an easy or a quick answer. I think it's iterative. I think it's temporal. And I think as time goes, we will evolve our thinking. And then different players will decide whether they choose to play by the rules or not. And those that choose not to play by the rules should be surfaced. The last point I'll make is around the Norwegian. I'll use Norway as an example, right? So the Norwegian sovereign fund is an interesting one. They've chose to step away from coal, but if you look at where their funds initially came from, it was quite interesting, right? So at some point, choices will have to be made. I'll pause there for now, Rebecca.
So I'm very conscious of the fact that we haven't really looked at one thing, which is the nature of regulation itself. So Joe, I'm going to ask you again, given what Shaheen has said, is that essentially one size doesn't fit all. We can't have a single regulatory framework all the way around the world, but and we need to understand that diversity, but we need to have a very broad lens on the ESG elements of all of this. So, I mean, I started off this by saying regulation was something that was always backward looking, because of the nature of the beast, that it's always something that's reacting to a previous crisis. So it's kind of the philosophy of regulation, if you like. Can we ever be forward looking with all of this and think about what we need to do? Because we do need to create proper change, don't we? We need to use regulations to engender change in the companies that we support and the trade that we're seeking to enable. So we have to use a pricing system. How do we do that?
That's the $1 million question, or let's use Sean's analogy. That's the crate of wine question, isn't it? No, we can definitely. I think we can go on about this for a very long time, but I just want to pick a few things out there that you've mentioned. And A is, does it seem that regulation is always reactive rather than proactive? I think if we look at the recent past, the last decade or the last 2 decades, it definitely seems to be fair to say that regulation has been reactive, and I guess that's driven by sort of like how times evolve and that you can't foresee everything that's coming down the line. But when it comes to this discussion here, it is therefore so important to make sure that we can work with regulators and sort of like convince them to take a proactive approach, to put the right incentives out there, right? Because at the moment, let's be fair, a lot of banks are actually already sort of like applying ESG ratings. We've got ESG ratchets in loans, for example, in terms of pricing mechanisms that then give you a lower margin if you meet certain ESG milestones, etc. All that is happening already. But from a sort of like regulatory perspective, from the balance sheet that banks have to hold against these loans or these LCs, etc., nothing changes, right? So the banks are basically wearing that cost, so to say. And there, of course, there needs to be something happening in future to keep sort of like this positive momentum going and to make it even broader. So certainly we'll need some help there from regulators. I think that positive incentive would work so much better than any sort of like negative sanctions or so. So that definitely I think is a big area. And again, this is, as you say, there is the sort of like the divergence of frameworks around the globe. There is also the dichotomy between what is E, what is S, and what is G, and where do you focus on? And that's of course where the UN SDGs, which you've incorporated in the work that you are doing, are playing such an important role, because they are looking at that spectrum holistically and not just, let's say, focus on the E or focus on the S or focus on the G. But yeah, this is definitely the main challenge, right? It's like, how do you create a framework that sort of like meets all these requirements, so that meets the requirement of focusing on all SDGs, so to say, focusing on the E, focusing on the S, and focusing on the G, and that also then creates a framework by which you can say, okay, because certain businesses are more ESG enhancing or are more positive, or to use your sort of like your scale are higher up on the scale. How can we now reward them for that? And how can we now, for example, support financiers in doing business with these companies by allowing them, as one example, to wear lower capital against transactions with these counterparties? I think we are at the real beginning of this process. And if we look at it from a trade finance perspective in particular, there are different areas of trade finance where this can be, I'd say, I would never want to use the word easy because it's not easy at all, but where this maybe is faster to be achieved than others. I'm looking at, for example, the long-term export finance, project finance space. It is more achievable to assess a transaction on its own merit, transaction by transaction almost, and try to sort of like fit them into certain frameworks once we have the frameworks, and therefore apply a certain capital weighting to them. Then let's say a short-term 90-day letter of credit. Of course, there you could also even go like and say, oh, this is coal bad, or this is supporting, I don't know, the delivery of a rotor for a wind farm park. Good, but it's not that easy, right? Where we have short-term trade finance, we've got such a multitude of transactions day by day going through the global system. You wonderfully showed this map before, Rebecca, and that's really where I think one of the key challenges again arises as well. Is how do you then have the systems to measure that?
So I mean, one of the issues is surely the one that Sean raised, which is that actually the requirement for regulatory frameworks is itself fluid, because all of a sudden we're having to think about things like whether or not there is a just war, whether or not there is something that we can do to facilitate, for example, weaponry getting to Ukraine, and that is seen as a good thing in principle to allow Ukraine to fight back, but it's not necessarily a good thing if you're on the other side of the fence. So I mean, there's a lot of fluidity and a lot of, well, I mean, economists would call it a normative set of things which are very subjective, if you like, that need to be defined. So I mean, Shaheen, just to go back to you, because I think the African perspective on this is super interesting, because you've already said, you've faced some of these problems before with Iran. Now, there's a big issue as well in Africa about stimulating trade more generally, and intra-African trade. To your point about the fact that you think about, well, do we do this through alternative suppliers, this just in case stuff through alternative suppliers, or do we source it regionally? So can we jump straight into becoming suddenly very ESG oriented without, from a very low base, say, of intra-African trade? Can we just make all of those changes quickly, or is it something that needs to be done on a very gradual basis, do you think?
I think the first thing to remember is Africa is a large continent. Despite what we see on the maps, I think that the Mercator projection confuses us a little bit. There's 55 countries, 41 currencies, more than 3,000 languages, different customs, many regulators, and different approaches to how we do things, right? So to your point, currently intra-Africa trade accounts for about 15% of total African trade. We speak as Africa as this homogeneous thing, but it isn't, right? The different countries are at different levels of advancement. Some are exceptionally far advanced. South Africa at one stage had additive manufacturing using titanium powder to create components for helicopters for its own defense industry, right? Which is very far away from an economy probably sitting in somewhere Central Africa where you're looking at agriculture as a primary source of revenue. So the question is, and the idea around what the AfCFTA, or the African Continental Free Trade Area or Agreement, is trying to do is to grow that intra-Africa trade from its current base of 15% to some point later on, wherever the percentage is, right? The challenge is if you want to grow trade, it means you're trying to tap into or meet a set demand for whatever good and service there is. The only way to do it on an intra-Africa basis is to find supply on the continent. So the AfCFTA talks to rules of origin, because one way to game the system is to actually bring the goods in from somewhere else and then fire them off. But that doesn't work, right? And in the long game, I always ask the question around why. So why have regulation? Why do the AfCFTA, right? The idea is to grow the lot of the African economies over time and to move away from just pulling things out of the ground and sending them somewhere else for processing. Now, pulling things out of the ground can be bad on the E and the S and the G front all around, right? I think pretty much everyone will understand the concept of blood diamonds, but not many people will understand that when you're driving something which seems to be environmentally friendly, like you want to push electric vehicles, and there's a little meme on the internet that shows somebody driving his electric vehicle and he feels very clean, but in the background there's a very dirty power station, right, pumping carbon into the air. Now, 80% of the world's cobalt comes out of the DRC. And cobalt is used as a caking agent for the manufacture of batteries, right? The challenge with that is, one, it can be environmentally unfriendly in the way it's mined. What a lot of people don't know is that there are massive social issues in cobalt mining where there are child labor issues involved, as there are with cocoa in Ghana. Right? The challenge for Africa is this. It's very easy to look from the outside in and say, well, you should go from point 0 to point 10. Europe and other parts of the world have had an opportunity to progress and grow through time and work their way through some of the dirty industries. Africa has not had that chance yet, coming from where it was to a point of independence. And essentially, a lot of the African population don't have access to what Europe might have access to. So less than 43% of Africans have access to electricity from a grid-based system. The opportunity comes in is that, well, should they need to go to grid, or can they just leapfrog straight to decentralized energy for residential use? There is a challenge, and we see that in South Africa, whereas if we had to do that, it would put pressure on the electricity generator or the electricity producers here, where they'll ultimately reach a tipping point on revenue and create issues for their own sustainability. So considerations that we might think about is, what is the idea of just transition? How do you move through from where we are to what may be considered good environmental practice and policy, good social practice and policy? Governance is not an issue because I think that in large part, some of those things are already in place, right? For African economies and for African populations, it's about what is the fair transition towards whatever the standard of ESG is. How does it impact food security? How does it impact small economies who may not have had the opportunity to grow and benefit from fossil fuels? Mozambique is a key example, right? So the Mozambique gas play, while it's not pure fossil fuel, it is still a fossil fuel, offers tremendous hope for Mozambique to shift from where it is to actually compete with Qatar, for example, in terms of the quality of gas output and the like. So I think it's a multivariate problem. It's multifaceted. I think governance is one aspect. There are elements of subjective assessment, and there are difficult problems, right? I'll use a non-African example of a wind power setup in an environment in one of the Nordic countries. So you have tremendous wind power potential and you set up the wind farm, but it's in a bird sanctuary, or it's impacting through the noise of the turbines, migratory patterns of game that sort of native populations hunt, right? These are multifaceted, multivariate problems, and applying a simple regulatory lens is going to get tricky over time.
Okay, thank you very much. And I mean, there was a piece in the paper this morning that was raising exactly that issue, which is in one of the sanctuaries in Uganda, amongst the giraffes and the elephants, they're drilling for oil at the moment, and it's a huge issue about whether or not Africa should actually be taking those steps, and how we go about creating that sustainability just in a way that allows nature and the requirements that we have globally as a human race to coexist. Sean, I want to end with you before I move into questions and then on to what BAFT and the Berne Union are doing in this space, because I promised everyone a tour around the world in 90 minutes. There is an element that we haven't really talked about within this framework, which is not just the metrics that we're using, but also the mechanisms that we're using. So the extent to which this can be automated, the extent to which we can use digital, the extent to which these are solutions that can be generated by everyone working together through non-manual means. Is it, what is your view on that? Just to wrap up this part of the session.
Yeah, so I think, to go back to one of the questions that you posed earlier, which is, what can regulation do here? I actually think that we are at a very promising moment, because paradoxically, because the regulations exist, but they're sort of a bit devoid of content or devoid of useful and implementable content, and so I think, not only do we have the opportunity to actually fill in the gaps, if you like, and I think in that sense that actually we are at a point where regulation could be forward-looking. And I think one of the reasons that it can do that, and maybe it's the most important reason because it's what makes it possible, is actually the technology that you're talking about. Because that technology will allow us to, you've shown yourself through your tools how that can be done at one level, but there is so much data out there that could be captured, if you look at the multiple sort of techs, the technologies and the fintechs or tech companies involved in this area, there's a lot of potential, essentially. So I think more than ever, not only are we in a position where we can actually speak to regulators about what the regulations really should be about, but we can tell them how to do it. And I think in a way that we couldn't have done maybe even 5 years ago. So there's that potential is most definitely there, and I do think, as always, and we've seen how creative. So your company, for example, Coriolis, in this area is relatively new, and we've seen that when the demand is created. And I think this is also another important aspect of what the regulators should be thinking about. When the regulation is there, the problem solvers, the solution providers, people like yourself, will come with the tools that we need. And I think so, whilst there aren't many people like you around at the moment. Sadly, there may be more in the future, but there may be that. But there also there's going to be a bigger universe of data that can be captured and ways of capturing that. And if the need to, at least one of the good things about regulation is that it forces banks. But I think, as always, there's always. We've talked about the carrot and the stick here. The carrot definitely is rewarding banks. Why are we, to use your term, why are we the frontline soldiers? Why are we the boots on the ground when we're not even being rewarded for that? And I think that is a conversation that has started. That will take, as Joe says, a long time to happen, because it appears in some way to reward banks for doing things that they should be doing anyway, or to reward them for basically remedying things that they got wrong in the past. But I do think that that carrot will be helpful. The stick, though, is also helpful, because if we have to do it, banks will comply, and they will want the tools to do it, and the solutions will come.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Diane in, because look, she's got a different angle on all of this, which is the American angle, and I think what you're saying effectively, Sean, is that now is the moment where we can actually combine some of the agendas that we've all had, the digital agenda, the sustainability agenda, the regulatory agenda, to produce something that is really positive for all of us. Diane, what is BAFT doing in this space, and how is the regulatory landscape changing in North America, and how are you reacting to all of that?
Great, thanks, Rebecca, and it's to all the prior speakers. It's been a great conversation so far. I think we in BAFT, though we are kind of looking at the framework that was introduced by the SEC 3 weeks ago, have been looking at the issue of sustainability from a global lens. Over the last 6 months, we've launched a working group and a number of work streams to tackle some of the core priorities for our members, both in the trade finance and the global payment space. So these are priorities that I think are shared both on kind of the work that you've been doing, as well as some of the work that ITFA is doing in terms of the need to have standards for sustainable transaction banking. We've also recently been engaging with the Net Zero Banking Alliance, really looking at the practitioner's guide that they published late last year and looking to produce an addendum to that guide, specifically on how to apply net zero for transaction banking. And that's something that we're looking to produce in the coming months. But another core priority consistent with what we've been talking about today is the importance on developing core guidance on sustainability reporting based on kind of the fragmented nature of reporting today. And I think consistent with what's been said, a desire for there to be greater consistency. We're cognizant that there's, as has been said, not one full reporting framework that will be adopted globally, but to the extent that our advocacy can push regulators to harmonize or create some uniform set of reporting standards, the more effectively we can, as an industry, work towards that. And I think kind of the fourth pillar that we've been working on is kind of in the advocacy and education space. You know, certainly the large economies, and there's some that have already produced frameworks, but we're seeing an acceleration of this in other jurisdictions. So there is a need for us as an industry, as a kind of transaction banking, trade finance, and payments, to have a proactive messaging and advocacy effort as other regulators look to introduce proposals. We want to be, to the extent possible, not just reacting to the proposals, but also educating and beginning the process of communicating with regulatory bodies in advance. And that's something that we're working towards, in addition to kind of the work of the collective, all of the colleagues on the line, to ensure that institutions across the globe have kind of a level set of understanding of what requirements are currently in place and what may be coming. And I think continual education as things are evolving seemingly more quickly is important. But specifically to the US, which I know, working in this space, there had been an interest and curiosity of where the US would be going in this space. I think some of those questions began to be answered on March 21st, when the SEC released its proposal for comment on how to, as they call it, enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures. The comment period's just opened through May the 20th. There is currently an effort in place by a number of trade associations to get the SEC to extend the comment period further. It's perceived by some in the US as a short time frame to be able to provide the types of commentary on the 500+ page kind of proposal that's being put in the US. So regardless, I think we as BAFT will be providing some comments, and we as a working group are currently in the process of providing some overview of in terms of how to compare what the US is looking to propose vis-a-vis other jurisdictions, namely the EU, but other nations. I think, but there are many pillars that are consistent. And I think the timeline, and looking at kind of one of your first slides, Rebecca, if we layer on if we assume that the SEC will implement a timeline similar to what they propose, there would be a lot of additional layers in terms of US disclosures beginning as early as 2023, moving through 2024, depending on whether we're discussing scope 1 or scope 2 disclosure, or scope 3, which kind of has a target for implementation the following year. So a lot happening, I think a lot to discuss politically within the US, where we'll be kind of just introducing the issue from a trade finance and a transaction banking perspective, but looking to influence how the US regulators approach disclosures.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. And I know you're slightly pushed for time, so I just wondered though. I mean, in terms of the whole approach that North America is taking, to what extent is it also including things like human rights? It's not just net zero, is it? The supply chain reviews and things that have been going on. That there's a lot of work around supply chains and making sure that human rights considerations are included as well, aren't there?
There are. I think in the framework that the SEC kind of released, it is more climate focused, but I think as in the whole of government US approach, there are parallel efforts that are looking at the social and governance issues that apply. I think there is an interest from the US administration to move towards a cohesive approach that would look at how firms, financial, but also corporates, are addressing sustainability aligned to the full scope of the SDGs. And I think that's forthcoming. This is kind of one in the first in a series of steps that the US will take over the coming months to really move this forward. And I think for those institutions that are based in the US or have operations there, there will be ample opportunities to comment, and we as BACT will be looking to provide commentary as these things emerge.
Well, I think you raised something else. And by the way, anyone, if you have got any questions, do stick them in chat, because it's important that we make sure that we've got all of those questions covered off by the panel as well. We are going to come on and look at how this all ties into what Coriolis has been doing in terms of Kosmos shortly. But I think the most important thing here is one thing that both Joe and you have raised, Diana, is something around education. So I know the ITFA wants to do a lot around education. Educating trade finance professionals in the complexity of all of this is a very important area as well. And so having the data, having the tools is a problem that we're trying to solve, but the role of the trade association really in educating on the complexities of all of this is very important as well. And Diana, Joe, either of you on that?
Yeah, if I may, and really great to hear also from the North America perspective from Diana. Absolutely, I think it's key because I mean, we've moved on again from where we were 2 or 3 years ago when certain people would just roll their eyes if you mentioned ESG. We've now gotten to a point where it's not a question anymore whether this is a business imperative or not. So we've already sort of like are in a positive space in that respect. But I would still say there's so much information out there. There's so much complexity as well, again, in the business that we do, because on the one hand, what might look good from an S perspective is not good from an E perspective, or vice versa. And of course, also things change. Again, coming back to the example that Sean brought up in terms of what sort of like arms businesses possibly good business in inverted commas. So there is definitely so much to be done in terms of like addressing the complexities of this field, which of course we started doing by having webinars, etc. My dream is still for there to be a sort of like an ESG library, so to say, on the ITFA website. That certainly is a work in progress. I can see it also inside my own organization, to be honest, and I'm sure it's the same for any other organization, but I'm just drawing on that. We had some learning sessions recently on various aspects ESG, and they spark a debate, right? And that's definitely what should happen, because there is different ways to look at it. There's not just one lens to look at ESG. And again, I think this is why education is so important, because there are so many different lenses to look at it. And again, this comes then also to assessing transactions, because one person might argue something is particularly green, but another person might look a step further and might say, actually, no, it's not green at all. Shaheen brought up a wonderful example, which I never get tired of saying when people are asking me, why are you not driving an electric car? And I remind them how the batteries are produced for the same. And I think it's all these things again, which of course therefore also make it a controversial topic at times, and which is why I think education is so important, because there's not just the one truth. There's multitudes of truths out there in a way. And I'm not a scientist, but I think it's such an important debate to have between academics, scientists, philosophers, everyone, honestly, to be fair.
And tech specialists as well, of course. And I mean, what I would say in the end is that ultimately this is about conflict resolution. So it's about understanding where an E objective might conflict. And if we're going to manage the transition process towards a more sustainable planet and more sustainable trade, then that means some form of conflict resolution as well. So, I mean, yeah, do keep the questions running. And I think what I would like to do, I'm just seeing a question coming in now. I think what I would like to do now is maybe just bring in Lee quickly to talk about what the Berne Union is doing, because we're getting close to the end, and it would be really helpful to understand a little bit more about what the Berne Union is doing, not least because the ECAs serve a completely different market. So it's more about understanding the SME perspective, more about understanding also the very political nature of all of this as well, where everybody else in the group so far has been quite careful not to not to tread on political toes. Actually, the ECAs have a much more political dimension to all of this, don't they?
Hi, everyone. And yes, Rebecca, that essentially is because of our government-backed nature and our policy ties to our governments. Although I would say in terms of the broad themes that you've covered here this morning, you know, there is a real intent for those, the frameworks that we follow internationally to converge and align with those of our private sector peers. Are we, I think you put the question to me, are we hit more swiftly because of the needs of our governments? You know, I think whether or not it's been swift is debatable. We'd probably have to borrow a glass or two from Sanford's bar and sit down and debate that. But we have been at this in terms of setting standards for ourselves and obligations since, you know, the late 90s and early 2000s, and there's been a real evolution in that time. I would be happy to talk about the Berne Union. So you're right, ECAs are a contingent of the Berne Union, although we are a broad association that includes private and as well multilateral insurers. And we're all faced with various, I'm going to talk a little bit more about climate because I am here representing the Berne Union's climate working group in particular. You know, we've got a real tidal wave, I think, of new obligations facing us. The joint statement on the international public support for the clean energy transition that came out of COP26, some of the obligations under the Export Finance for Future E3F initiative, some of the regional frameworks, such as in Europe, and our own various domestic obligations where our governments are pointing to ECA saying, you need to align with our national climate action plans, you need to commit to TCFD reporting, etc. And so the Berne Union Climate Working Group has set about, you know, to try and make sense of all of this, figure out, you know, where are the implementation best practices? How do we benefit from the work and progress of others? I can talk about sort of the three different work streams that we're focused on. The first is in regard to innovation. And you'll see coming from this group, hopefully very publicly, just as an innovation series where we can really scratch the surface. Thank you for that. Of what's going on in terms of new product development and also innovation within transactions. If we were to continue to try and solve for climate with the same toolkit that we've already got, we probably wouldn't make much more progress. And so innovation is a pretty critical theme for us. And we're looking to profile not just the best practices and emerging practices within our membership, but more broadly across industry. And so to the extent that any of those on the line here have, you know, something they would like to come and showcase and profile and have a debate or dialogue with the Berne Union Climate Working Group, please do reach out to me because we'd be happy to pull you into that discussion. Then you've been talking about standardization and regulation and data. This gets a little bit into the low carbon transition technical aspects of this working group, where we're really hoping to pick apart and make it a little bit easier for those at maybe the lagging end of the spectrum to get their heads around what it means to account for one institution's portfolio, what it means to get your head around, approaching reporting, how to have hard conversations with our clients and our exporters and our customers about, the data that they need to start delivering and the integrity behind that data. And then lastly, again, around the theme of standardization and regulation, we've got a policy coherence stream here. The real intent across ECAs in all our frameworks is to ensure that we're going lockstep together and that there is a level playing field, and that our exporters are competing on the basis of the quality of their own exports, as opposed to which ECA or government-backed institution can provide most favorable terms. And therefore, there is a definite incentive to ensure that we are looking closely at the various policy obligations we're sharing and understanding, the various maybe the points of departure and how they're being implemented, and try and bring those together. And that definitely does require some collaboration across industry. And so again, to the extent that the membership here on the line this morning are keen to come in and have some conversation with us about, the challenges that you're facing, and that maybe collectively we're facing in our transactions, and various policy commitments, very happy to do that and just reach out. I guess maybe the last thing, I've gone quite quickly because I know that Rebecca's keeping an eye on time this morning. We aim to make the output of this group very public. And so if you go to the Berne Union website, you'll actually see a climate working group page. All of the library, all of the minutes, all of the deliverables that are forthcoming will be anchored in that page. And so you should have broad access there, and always happy to chat.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry to be scampering through. It's really because what I want to do is give everyone an opportunity to get involved with the conversation now. So we have 20 minutes more. I'm going to show you a couple of things that Kosmos has been doing, but if there are any questions, do let us know. And I think for just while those questions might be appearing in the chat, what I really want to stress at this stage is when we first started the Kosmos working group, and when we first started the whole idea of bringing everyone together, what we wanted to do was make sure that the Berne Union, the BAF, the ITFA, the ICC, everyone was working together, because I think, to Sean's point right at the very, very beginning, we can't do this unless we have a standardized how. We know why, we know what we've got to do, we just don't know how to do it, because the regulators have missed this point. They've missed the point that you need to understand, and you need to have a set of metrics that are very clear and very focused and very doable as well, and very, very, very measurable, because otherwise we are going to end up with this greenwash situation.